Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you first of all for joining us tonight for our event, Effective and Impactful Research Careers in STEM. I'm Alistair, I'll be hosting tonight. But before we begin, I would like to first acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay respect to elders both past, present and emerging of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. Before I introduce our panelists, I would also like to invite you to check out Effective Altruism UniMelb, also known as EA UniMelb. We've left a link for our Facebook page in the chat, and I think this is a really good place to start just to see what past events we've had and get a bit of a feel for what we do as a club. If you weren't already aware, Effective Altruism is about doing good better. We're a movement that seeks to answer the question of how we can do the most good for the world with our limited resources. We run in-depth discussion events, careers workshops, guest speaker discussions like these, and a whole range of social events. Even during COVID, EA UniMelb in particular is known for its warm and inviting community. So if you're looking to make some new friends coming out of lockdown who are interested in making the world a better place, we'd love to see you at our next catch up. We've also put our membership sign up link in the chat. So as most of you will have gathered, this is a Q&A panel event which gives all of you the opportunity to gain a valuable insight into STEM research careers from our three panelists. In particular, we want to focus on how research careers and career choices can make an effective impact in some of the global issues prioritized by the effective altruism philosophy. Ultimately, the main area we want to give insight into are the ways in which you can make an impact with your career, whether that's in STEM research or some other field of research. So we highly encourage you to ask questions and engage with our lovely panelists. And we hope that by the end of the night, you'll have a better understanding of research options beyond university, as well as some of the different avenues available for you to give back with your career. Just briefly, this event will be roughly structured into two parts. First of all, a short talk from each of our panelists about their work and research and how they came to be where they are today. Secondly, we'll have the big Q&A portion. Now, questions can be submitted at any time through Slido, and a link for that has been left in the chat. Just remember, if your question is for one speaker in particular, make sure to include that in your question. Okay, to introduce our guests, with us tonight, we're very fortunate to have three very distinguished guests. First of all, we have Madeline Mitchell, a research lead at Food-Ag CRC and research fellow at RMIT's Centre for Urban Research, who also completed a PhD in plant scientists at Cambridge after graduating UniMelb. Bianca is a cell biologist in sustainable food development who completed her undergraduate degree at UniMelb and her PhD in Monash. She's since gone on to be the founder and director of Cellular Agriculture Australia and has been a treasurer of EA Melbourne, a broader group related to effective altruism in the Melbourne area. Finally, last but definitely not least, we have Jonas Sandbrink, who is a biosecurity researcher at the Future of Humanity Institute. He has done specialized work in the dual use risks of biotechnology, vaccine platforms, and also global catastrophic biological risk. I'll now pass it on to our panelists to tell you about themselves, their work, and their career path. If you have any questions for the Q&A section, please put them into Slido throughout the individual speakers, and then we'll get to them after. So take it away, Madeline.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, everyone. And thanks for the invite. And also, hi to the panelists. I'm excited to see some overlap already between some of the things we're interested in. So this will be an interesting discussion. If I could, I will share my screen now and just have some slides, mostly because they're pretty, some photos. All right, so I'm just waiting for it to go full screen. Come on, computer. Okay, cool. So yeah, this is me. I mean, I have, look, I'll tell you a bit about, where I'm up to now. And so this is, I'm working at Food-Ag, which is a cooperative research centre. So making that, bridging that gap between industry and research. And so the Food-Ag is really focused on data and digital driven solutions for a sustainable food future. So that's that, photo up the top right. And I can tell you a story that makes a lot of sense looking back as to how I got to this point. But I just want to make really clear too that this is only a story I can really tell looking backwards. At the time I wasn't as sure of where I was going. So really don't worry if you don't know where you're going either. It took me a long time and it took a lot of self-reflection and a lot of different experiences for me to kind of work out my path. Okay, so this is me, as a plant scientist working in sustainable agriculture and specifically around climate resilient agriculture at the moment. Okay, so briefly, this is my career. This is the linear version. When I was a kid, I loved nature, watched a lot of documentaries and got out in nature a lot. When I was in high school, I did visual arts, sciences, languages, literature. And so then when I went to Melbourne Uni, I made a decision not to make a decision right away, and I did an art science double degree, which you could do back in those days. So I did art science and I did biology, chemistry, ended up majoring in biochemistry and plant sciences. And then I did, in the arts degree, I ended up doing French and history and philosophy of science and literature. But in the end, as I was going through that, and you can see that's me down the bottom there, graduating with my Bachelor of Science, in the end, I chose not to finish the arts degree because I realized I wanted to pursue a PhD in science. And so I just wanted to kind of leave it I thought I'd just get stuck into my PhD, so I didn't end up finishing the arts degree. But really through that period, that was partly me, becoming more and more interested in science for that really practical impact. And so I suppose too, there, you can see my parents. So mum is a now retired social worker and dad is now a retired psychologist. And so it was very important from them, I suppose, for them, that they made a difference in their careers, and that kind of got instilled in me without me really realizing. And so I got quite into plant sciences because it was really practical. I loved literature, loved French, but it didn't have that practical element to it. So I got really into plant sciences. The other thing with sort of where I grew up and where I came from that's really shaped me, I think, is that I grew up in Bendigo, and I grew up in Bendigo during the Millennium Drought. And so I don't come from a farming background, but I got a really strong sense of how important agriculture was to the rural and regional communities. And I sort of got into plants as a way of maybe supporting agriculture through new and better crops that could benefit farmers and consumers in the environment. And then through my undergrad as well, one of the other opportunities I had was to do some work for a small consultancy. So they did a lot of regional and agri kind of work. And one of the things that we did there was I helped put together a report on the social effects of the drought in the Wimmera region of Victoria. And that got provided to state government. And then the state government provided some funds to their region. So I suppose, again, it was just a small sort of nudge along the way to, okay, so if I do this kind of work, I can actually see the impact. And then really, I did a PhD because I liked being at university. I'm hoping you're getting some of that experience. I know the last 18 months have been really tough for everyone, but I feel for people who are in these formative years. And so I grew up in Central Victoria. I got to Melbourne Uni and I thought, wow, this is cool. There are lots of people who are into stuff that I'm into. And so a PhD was kind of an opportunity to engage with that further and go to Cambridge. And so I did this PhD in plant sciences, and I'll tell you a little bit about my research as well. And then that's me. Prior to this role, I worked at CSIRO, Agriculture and Food, for 5 years. So that was sort of broadly my career, but as I say, it only looks linear when you look backwards on it. I'll tell you a little bit about the different types of research I've done, and all of this will be probably a bit of a whirlwind tour, but very happy. This is kind of, let's start a discussion, see what sparks your interest. So this too is kind of the context of what I was learning about when I was doing my biology and plant sciences, and then over the years, since. And this is around what it means to feed and clothe the world in a sustainable way. So I think what's really interesting about agriculture is that it has really high dependency on the natural world, has potentially really high impacts on the natural world, but it is essential. You know, we need to feed and clothe people and provide shelter and things, and all of those things that agriculture, and in particular plants, can provide. So, you know, there's some stats from the FAO about, you know, 50–70% extra food we need to produce in the coming decades to feed the growing population. But I quite like these as some stats. So in 1961, we had 1 chicken for every 416 people in the world, and we had 3 billion people. But by the, you know, say 50 years later, by the time we get to 2016, we now have 9 chickens per person and 7.5 billion people. So for me, that's just a really stark example of how big an impact agriculture has on the planet. You know, it uses a huge proportion of our fresh water, it uses a lot of our land, and it's really big in that way. And so that's sort of the framing for a lot of my work. And then to begin with, this is maybe a link with Jonas. So the first couple of projects I worked on, and this is sort of where I had a sense of some of the things that I valued and where I wanted to work, and then there are also my strengths. And my strengths going through undergrad were around the plant physiology, so whole plant stuff, and molecular biology. And so my PhD was looking at a mechanism that's evolved in algae to make their photosynthesis more efficient. And eventually the idea was to use that understanding to improve crop photosynthesis and improve crop yields. So all part of that, how we can produce more using less of the world's resources. The second big project that I worked on was at CSIRO. And so this is a big project. It was part of a big collaboration. And that was looking at new sources of vegetable oil. And so you can see in the bottom figure there's the grey outlines of plants. And so oil traditionally comes from the seed or the seed-related tissue. So you can see in soybeans, sunflower, and canola there. And so the challenge with that is that it's just a small part of the plant. So the yellow bits are highlighted, they're the oil-producing bits. And it's just a small part of the plant, and it's harvested late in development. And so I was working with some metabolic engineers to engineer these plants to produce oil everywhere, in the leaves in particular. And so that gives us the potential to have more oil, and also to have, say, dual purpose crops where you can have the leaves for oil and then harvest the seed as well for food. So like I said, whirlwind tour. You can ask me more about this if you want later. And then on CSIRO, I went on to work on fibres. And so this came from an idea that, and I would just flag this as a thing to maybe discuss later, is something called the circular economy. And I suppose even just, you know, understanding where our food comes from, where our fibres come from. So all of our nylon, polyesters and things like that comes from petrochemicals. So that's effectively plastic. It doesn't biodegrade, and when you wash it, you end up releasing tiny pellets of microplastics into the waters. And so this was a work that we were doing with cotton and potentially with other plant-based fibres. And this was around re-engineering the cotton fibres to have enhanced properties so that we could use it as biodegradable and renewable substitute for those plastic-based artificial fibres. And these are a couple of down. This is a little bit what happens when you start communicating science, is that we're definitely not this far along with the research, but when you communicate with the public, you know, the concept around it is very exciting. And so the idea that we were talking about was introducing a small amount of kind of resilience and stretch into the cotton, so you might not have to iron your t-shirts or your shirts, and then also producing coloured cotton as mostly a proof of concept, but theoretically, you know, that could remove the need for the dyes. But then I just wanted to give you an update. So that sort of was the biotech part of my career, PhD and 5 years at CSIRO. But I was really feeling the urgency of climate change and of, the urgency of what we need to, you know, how much we need to change our food production systems in the coming years. And so the interesting, like the biotech is great, but if you're working in plant biotech, it's 5, 10, 15, 20 years between doing something in the lab and getting it working in the field. And so I moved roles in January last year, and I started this new role, joint role with RMIT and Food-Agility. And so these are two examples of some projects that I'm now working on. And the one on the, I'll do the one on the right first, we'll go right to left, is something called the Cool Soil Initiative. And that is looking at some big companies that buy grains, so Mars Pet Care and Kellogg's in particular, and others you might not have heard of, because they're in a different part of the supply chain. But they want to invest in the resilience of their supply chains. So they're actually supporting on-ground practice change in the regions where they buy their grain from, and that's around improving soil health and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so I'm involved on the project management committee for that one. And then this one on the left here with NAB, this is one I'm leading. And this is one where we're looking at the major risks and opportunities related to climate and sustainability in Australian agriculture. We're then identifying some key adaptation options for farmers and looking at the benefit of those and turning that into a tool that like the bankers and the farmers can use to then go and do their own due diligence around what it would mean for them on the farm. So I feel like that's the whirlwind tour of my research. I just wanted to kind of highlight within this is that for me, like I said, it kind of came from my parents, but it's obviously something that's resonated with me because I've continued in this way, is this idea of making a difference. And so that's been a really strong theme. But there's also a bunch of things for me around the how, and I'm just aware of time. So I'm going to just skip these slides. These are some examples of the sort of high-tech agriculture, the GM, the indoor farming, the alternative proteins, and the precision agriculture. I think it's also really interesting and important that we look at the more sort of low tech and the kind of stuff around soil health and biodiversity and Indigenous care for country. Lots of interesting things happening there, and valuing nature as part of our farming systems, and that's another part of my current role. But then the other thing I just wanted to touch on before finishing up and passing on to the next speaker is that for me, so that the what I do is really important, and feeling like I'm doing something that is, as I said, contributing to agricultural sustainability for the environment, but also for all of the people. But for me too, it's really important the how. And so a lot of what I do sort of within my career and alongside it is to do with diversity and inclusion in STEM. So we know that that diverse teams make better decisions, they do better science, there's better outcomes for everybody. And so part of what I'm really interested in is supporting that next generation of scientists, because that's where I'm working, and kind of paying it forward through mentoring and teaching and volunteering. So I'm on the Research Advisory Council for a farming system group and things like that. And so I think it's maybe a little bit more of a tangent, but I think it's really, really important. And for me too, the other value for me within science is that sense of community and making it a supportive place where people actually can do their best science, and do good better, as you say. So thank you, and I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Madeline. Super interesting to hear about your field and some of the influences on your career path. Bianca, would you like to tell us about your pathway and work?
Absolutely. I will share my screen. Great. So I will also be going through my career and talk a little bit about cellular agriculture. And I've actually just done an hour-long keynote on this, so I'll try to give you the abridged version of what cell ag technologies are. I'll start off with my story first, though. So I did a Bachelor of Science at the University of Melbourne, as well as a Diploma of Italian, and had always loved science. I majored in human structure and function and physiology, in other words, anatomy. But I didn't want to become a medical doctor, which is what most people do when they major in those fields. I knew I wanted to do science. And unfortunately, during a Bachelor of Science, you don't actually get to do science, you just learn about it. You learn the facts, you learn the statistics, you learn the concepts. You're not actually applying the scientific method to anything. So I really wanted to know what it was like to be a researcher and be a critical thinker. So I then did the next obvious step, which is an honours degree, which is basically a test drive of what it's like to be a researcher for about 9 months. So I moved to Monash University to look at how the anatomy of the blood vessels in the kidneys develop and how that affects various kidney diseases. Loved that, got to work at the Australian Synchrotron, got to collaborate with a lot of researchers around Australia and got to travel as well. So again, the obvious next step was to do a PhD. And this time my project was looking at the effects of premature birth on heart development. And, you know, again, really fun stuff. It was, I was at this point in my career choosing things based on what I really enjoyed doing. You can see already though that my career was becoming quite linear and specialized. I was putting myself into a niche. And I realized in my first year that I really needed to develop a broad toolkit of soft skills and experience life outside of academia. I was also having a quarter life crisis about, you know, how can I make the world better? There are so many major challenges in the world. And my friend actually introduced me to effective altruism. I read Doing Good Better by William McCaskill, and my life absolutely changed. I was listening to the 80,000 Hours podcast, and I was in the lab pipetting away whilst having my headphones in. And it was the episode where Raoul Wiblin interviewed Bruce Friedrich from the Good Food Institute. And I'm not sure if you know who he is, but his institute focuses on developing the alternative protein sector. And that was when I first learnt about clean meat, which was what it was called back then. And it was the first time I realized that I could apply my cell biology expertise to a field outside of biomedical research. And so, you know, I was becoming obsessed with this idea of effective altruism, using evidence-based reasoning to make the world a better place. And that's when I started volunteering for Effective Altruism Melbourne. I was elected treasurer and also held the EA Australia conference that year. And that helped me gain so many skills outside of research. So everyone who helped organize this event, you know how much coordination, how much communication and marketing that you have to do. And generally you don't get to do that in a science degree. So that has definitely helped me get to where I am today. I also did a STEM policy internship at the Academy of Technology and Engineering to, again, step outside of academia and get a high-level understanding of how the world works. So how does industry interact with government, which interacts with academia? How do we make things happen effectively? I then also did another internship in science communication at a PR agency called Scientel, where I did a lot of science writing for the general public. And that was, again, really fun and allowed me to step outside of my comfort zone, where I got to write about climate change, ecology, all sorts of sciences in publications like The Leader. So if any of you are familiar with The Leader, you have to really distill complex topics into very easy to understand sound bites. And sorry, before I get into where I am today, I finished my PhD at the start of the pandemic, and I really wanted to, for a long time, move overseas and get a postdoc, because that's what most people do after a PhD. Obviously couldn't do that in lockdown. And it was a blessing in disguise because it forced me to stay in Australia and look at the cell ag ecosystem in my own country. And there was no activity bar 2 startups happening in Australia. So I founded an organization, a nonprofit called Cellular Agriculture Australia, which I'll tell you about in a moment. I also recently became an honorary fellow at the University of Melbourne, and also joined the Superstars of STEM program, which is a 2-year-long program run by Science Technology Australia, and it's funded by the federal government. And Madeline didn't mention this, but she was also a Superstars of STEM in the previous cohort. And as Madeline said before, this looks really neat and tidy, and it seemed as though I knew what I was doing the entire duration of my career. But what people don't see is what I call the anti-CV, all the things that I attempted to do but failed. So I didn't get into my first preference after high school. I failed subjects at university. When I was looking for honours supervisors, so many professors ghosted me and didn't respond to my emails. I didn't get a PhD scholarship initially. I tried multiple times. And of course, my plans to do this postdoc in cellular agriculture in the US was foiled by COVID. And this is a very, windy, tortuous road that I'm sure all of you can relate to, but I just kind of want to normalize how unpredictable your career can be. You can listen to 80,000 hours as much as you want and go to all the career panels, but at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of trial and error, and that's okay. I'm still figuring out what I'm doing in life. I just want to really quickly explain what cellular agriculture is for those of you who don't know. So there is something about animal products that you just can't get from plants, and this is what makes so many of us obsessed with food and what makes a lot of people struggle to become vegan or vegetarian. The way cheese stretches and melts, the way egg whites whip up to form these stiff peaks for meringue, and that delicious umaminess that you get in a ribeye steak. We love animal products so much that we have become really good at producing them. We use about 70 billion animals in our food system every year to feed about 8 billion humans. We've just become really efficient at producing as many animals, as much eggs and dairy as possible from all the precious resources available to us: land, water, energy, antibiotics. And that's obviously a really good thing for the world because it means that more people are able to afford high quality protein. But that of course comes at a price, which we're now paying. I'll kind of skip through this really quickly because I'm sure you're sick of hearing all the terrible things about animal agriculture in our world. But basically, we're using up a lot of land. Livestock contributes to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, despite the fact that livestock only contributes to about 1/3 of our protein supply. If you take all the biomass of birds on our planet, 75% of it is poultry for us to eat, or for them to lay eggs for us to eat. And the majority of the biomass of mammals on the world are either humans or the livestock that we eat. So I'm sure you can appreciate from these very high level figures that we're running out of planet and we need to make food more sustainably. I know I said animal ag is really efficient, but it's not actually efficient enough, especially for our growing population. If you look at how the conversion rate of feed to animal to food, a chicken requires 8 energy calories of feed in order for humans to get 1 food calorie in return, which is a conversion rate of about 13%, which is very inefficient. Cows are much worse, about 33 energy calories for us to get 1 food calorie in return. And that's because an animal's body is not engineered purely for human consumption. Those extra energy calories and all the crops that we're feeding those animals are going towards making that animal stay alive, letting it breathe and walk around and do things that an animal should do. So how are we expected to feed about 2 billion more people on our planet within 30 years' time? You all know the answer to this. Got to go vegan or vegetarian. But the data is actually showing that despite the fact that there is so much evidence that animal ag is terrible for our environment and for our health and we should eat less meat, we're seeing the complete opposite trend. per capita consumption of meat, milk, and eggs is on the rise globally. People want to eat delicious food, but no one wants to feel bad doing it. And behavior change is just really hard, particularly for these tight timelines that we have for these major global challenges like climate change, global warming, antimicrobial resistance, etc. So instead of trying to change consumer demand for animal products, it's time to reconsider the supply and make these products more sustainably and ethically. So the thing about Cell Ag that really inspired me was the fact that I didn't have to choose a single disease to focus on and spend my whole life becoming an expert in solving. I could use my science knowledge to work on lots of different problems: human health, climate change, antimicrobial resistance, deforestation, etc. So Cell Ag is basically a suite of technologies that allows us to farm cells rather than animals. Cell Ag is a pretty new area of research. It was coined only in 2015, but the studies are showing and are predicting that this technology will require less land and water and energy resources, as well as produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions when compared to intensive animal agriculture. And just as a very nice bonus, no animals have to die in this process. I might not go through this because it's a bit heavy and busy, but feel free to ask questions. As I said, this process is much more efficient because we're feeding the meat cells directly rather than the whole animal. And so you get about an 80% conversion rate. All these products on the screen are real food products produced via cellular agriculture. However, no products are currently available for human consumption because, as I said, the field is really new. Bar one company who's selling it in Singapore, but I won't get into that now. So that's where we come in. We're a science organisation trying to develop that research and development sector here in Australia. We're developing a talent pipeline to get more students, academics and investors involved. And Australia is a really good place to do that because our government's already investing a lot of money into the regenerative medicine sector, which can all be applied to food via cellular agriculture. We're also building a connected community of all the stakeholders involved to foster healthy competition in the space, and also using science communication, effective science communication, to build positive public awareness of the field and explain to future consumers what this technology is, but more importantly, explain what it isn't and dispel a lot of myths that are circling around. So I'll leave it there. I'll be happy to take any questions after in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Bianca. Really interesting to hear about the work going on in such a new field. Jonas, would you like to present now on your work and career path?
Yeah, thank you so much. So exciting to be here. Great to meet so many of you. I'm so excited. I think given I'm in the UK, we don't interact that much with Australia, but I think these events are such a great opportunity. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I don't have a fancy set of slides, sadly, so you'll have to make do with my face. Yeah, I can give a bit of a background on kind of where I'm coming from, and it says some things here. So I'm originally from Berlin. And I now work on biological risk and in particular global catastrophic biological risks and biotechnology risks. So kind of how did I get there? So I did my high school in Berlin, and then I kind of was unsure what to do, like interested in medicine. I actually applied to German med school, but I failed to get in because I forgot to send up a copy of my application. That was quite devastating. And so I kind of sat out a year, kind of thought more about what to do. And then I heard about this like cool thing called effective altruism. I was like, oh, maybe I should dig more into this. And kind of became involved, founded a student group in Münster, which is a student town in Germany. And then at the end of the year, throughout the year, I applied to Oxford for medicine still, and got in, and I started in Oxford. And yeah, and for the longest time, I wasn't sure what to do. And like, I was like, global health, that sounds interesting. But then at some point, kind of this idea of long-termism and really making the future go well and reducing catastrophic and existential risk came onto my radar. And then I chatted to some people at the Future of Humanity Institute and went to an Effective Altruism Global Conference where I met Jamie Yassif, and she really inspired me. And I actually, after that conversation, switched my bachelor's thesis from something on Senolytics and aging research to vaccines and platform vaccine technologies. And then ended up doing a summer research fellowship at the Future of Humanity Institute. And the whole COVID pandemic then obviously kicked off, and I was actually, as a medical student, on the intensive care unit helping out. And I realized, really, we need to prevent this stuff. Once people are inside the hospital, like, there's not much we can do anymore. And I kind of decided to, I want to move out of medicine and do more kind of pandemic prevention, and in particular, preventing the larger scale pandemics. So what's so why do we care about biological risk? And I think it's pretty obvious in the wake of COVID. Like, there are large scale events that really could drastically have drastically catastrophic effects, not only kill many people, but potentially also destabilize society. And especially within effective altruism, there's this like idea of long-termism, so that the value of the future really might be really great. So there might be trillions of happy, intelligent beings out there in the future. But if there's an existential event that like prevents all those happy lives from happening, so in a sense, there's a great urgency, especially during this century where we are for the first time accessing really powerful technologies to make the century go well and make us not eradicate ourselves. And so that's kind of where like the biosecurity work comes in. So if we think about kind of the global catastrophic biological risk space, so these are really the largest biological events like pandemics. We usually say maybe they start around like killing 10% of the population. And that is when we might see like these long-term destabilizing effects. So we focus on those as a community mostly, because they are the most neglected. So there's a bunch of money being spent on general public health, general broad countermeasures, like vaccines as well. But I think there are very few people that actually think about biotechnology risks and biosecurity and how to prevent bad actors from leveraging the increasingly powerful and accessible methods for viral engineering and viral enhancement. So we focus in on those. So that's especially what FHI is thinking about. But we also focus on really cutting edge countermeasures and what we can do to prevent pandemics. So if I'm thinking of like, a bunch of people interested in working on these kind of biological risks, like where are the sections, like what are the kind of topics you can work on? And I think three things really come to mind. So firstly, it's like countermeasures. So vaccines, therapeutics. We've seen in COVID, like, the COVID pandemic really, was kind of managed through like these like vaccines that we were able to develop really relatively rapidly. For the first time during a pandemic, we actually had access to the vaccine technology and were able to actively administer them. And so I think really, I've worked in the past also on platform vaccine technologies. I had a great joy to work with my bachelor's thesis with Sarah Gilbert, who is one of the minds behind the Oxford vaccine, and also did some work on RNA vaccines. So I think really these countermeasure platform technologies that enable us to rapidly adapt to a new pathogen and then roll them out very quickly, I think are extremely promising. And I think we definitely want to invest more efforts and resources there. So I think that's like one broad category of things. So firstly, countermeasures. The second one is detection. So really, once something spreads, it is really important to detect it early, because then you can contain it. one of the critical areas there that especially we at FHI, but also other people are advocating for is metagenomic surveillance or biosurveillance. And that might look like within hospitals, anyone that comes in with a respiratory infection just is tested with a pathogen agnostic method. So a diagnostic measure that is not limited to one pathogen, but that tells you exactly what infects them. And this might be especially important in areas where new pathogens might cross from animals to humans. So we can then pick up like, oh, there's something new going on. We should lock down this hospital, really try to contain it. And I think that will be super critical to preventing this world in which, new pandemics pop up everywhere, because we need to be very swift and agile in like how we then contain them. So I think that's really, sequencing technology, I think will be really critical to advance for that. And I think we need lots of brilliant minds for that. And then lastly, really it's about prevention. And the wider pandemic preparedness community is a lot focused on zoonotic preparedness. So preventing kind of these pathogens, these viruses that spill over, that infect an animal and then come into humans, like potentially COVID or SARS-CoV-2. I think there's a lot of focus on there in the mainstream area. But actually, if we look at really where might the greatest pandemic threats come from, like those global catastrophic biological risks, the GCBRs, that might have a long-term destabilizing effect on society, then I think we're thinking more, oh, this might be something deliberately engineered, because that is most likely to yield something. If something is optimized for transmissibility and virulence, so like the amount of death and harm it causes, then that might actually be the most worrying, because it might kill the most people and might have the most destabilizing effect, especially potentially if there's an uncertainty around the origin and countries are starting to arguing, and that has knock-on effects with regard to great power war. So really the field of biosecurity, so there's biosafety, which is kind of like preventing accidental outbreaks from labs, accidental lab escapes. And then there's biosecurity, and biosecurity is kind of what we roughly do. Sometimes DCBR preparedness is also labeled biosecurity, because that's like kind of maybe where our most comparative advantage lies. So biosecurity is really preventing misuse of technology, preventing bad actors, bad people from misusing pathogens and the technologies that we have. So what do we do within biosecurity? So there's like a lot of different strands of research. I think like broadly it can be divided into kind of thinking about policy interventions. So like how do we govern biotechnology development? So we say some technologies have dual use potential. So that means if a good technology may be misused for something bad. So for instance, people engineer oncolytic viruses, so viruses for cancer therapy, and they insert different elements that make them evade the immune response and target a specific set of cells and kill them highly effectively. And one could very well imagine how like exactly these approaches to engineer a virus could be transferred to a virus that is actually engineered to cause a bad event. So kind of we need to regulate how researchers are allowed to do these experiments. And that is where biotechnology governance comes in. Then I think there's like a section of work around preventing biological weapons and working with the Biological Weapons Convention, and really thinking about, how can we verify that people aren't working on biological weapons? Because I think one of the largest factors for someone to start working on biological weapons is if they know that someone else is working on biological weapons. Kind of how do we deter effectively from developing biological weapons? And then there's a last set of stuff that maybe looks like thinking a bit more, and that is something quite new and something that I'm quite interested in. It's like this idea of differential technology development. So we're coming into this age of where increasingly powerful technologies are being developed. And we're kind of just rampantly developing all of them. We're not really considering the risks. And I think we maybe need to be a bit more strategic with these powerful technologies. Maybe we should first develop the ones that, for instance, help us contain and detect the pandemic before we hand everyone the keys to setting off a new deadly pandemic. So maybe focus first on sequencing and all of that stuff before developing viral engineering further. But then also there's some stuff around differential technology development that looks like substituting more dangerous and more dual use technologies with others that are more safe. And one example here might be viral vector vaccines that also are fed by research. So they also lead to research on immune evasion and lead to many more people having experience with engineering viruses. But at the same time, we now have like this great technology of RNA vaccines, the vaccines that are just based on nucleic acids and don't involve any viral engineering. So maybe we should just fund a lot more RNA vaccine technology and then make viral vector vaccine technology obsolete to some extent. And that means that maybe overall our risk portfolio, the risk portfolio of our technology portfolio is a lot safer. So those are like some approaches and some ideas on like how to tackle kind of these biological risks. I think if you're looking for concrete ideas for paths to take into the space, I think like roughly two things come to mind. Either you are really saying, I'm really interested in this technical stuff, like countermeasures, vaccines, therapeutics, sequencing for detecting pandemics. I think then you should really like skill up, maybe get a PhD in a technical field and really look out for like high impact projects then where maybe Open Philanthropy Project or some other funding sources funding a project that really seems like, yeah, we really need to get this off the ground. And this might include something like, yeah, super PPE. I think we should definitely develop super PPE because like that might be actually like such a great prevention to like existential risk from biological agents. So I think like there's a bunch of work happening there. And then the other end of the spectrum is kind of the biotechnology risk and the biosecurity angle. And I think if you're really interested in that kind of career, which is a lot more at the intersection of science and policy, I think then there are many great opportunities to get involved with that. I think you can, like, for instance, start by interning at the Biological Weapons Convention. You can start by doing one of the summer research fellowships with, for instance, the Future of Humanity Institute, but also the Stanford Existential Risk Initiative or any of the other existential risk initiatives. And I think really the critical bit for this stuff is that it's quite community-led, and we have quite a lot of connections and experience, and especially you need like some mentorship to know about how to talk about these things and kind of what to publish, what not to publish. And hence, really, you should really, I think, get involved with research and try to find a mentor that is already working in the field and maybe do a research project with them. And I think that's something that you can easily do on the side of some other commitment and then kind of get your foot into the door on that angle. Yeah, so I think that's 15 minutes. Thank you very much. And I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Jonas. That was super interesting. It is now time for our Q&A section. Remember to submit any more questions via Slido. We've got a lot of really fantastic questions. You can also upvote questions that have already been put in that you really want to have answered on the Slido. For our first question, I think, Madeline, how did you go about shifting from an industry focus to a climate focus? And did it require any different skills? What did the transition look like?
Good question. I did kind of gloss over that. The short answer is that my current work is still industry focused. And I think that's why it's so exciting. And I think something that I would reiterate from what Bianca and Jonas have been saying is that breadth of experience. And so I perhaps didn't emphasize that as much in my talk, but well, I suppose even from doing the art science degree, I was always looking for that research for impact. I didn't want to just, do some research and publish a paper at the end of it. And so I've been involved in a whole lot of outreach and science communication as well. And I suppose too that, yeah, so for me, it's about creating those broader links and being that in some ways translator between different disciplines, or in this case, between industry and research. And so with my work at CSIRO, that was industry focused, but, you know, plant science industry focused. Whereas now my role is actually co-funded by NAB and IAG, the insurer. And that's, it's a really exciting space to be in. So I suppose, and that's because my broader role within Food Agility is looking at the ways we can support and reward farmers for looking after their natural capital, so their plants, animals, soil and water, because farmers that do that should be more productive, more profitable, and ultimately more climate resilient. And so banks and financial, like insurers, they all realize that. And in the same way that Mars and Kellogg's are investing in their supply chains, banks are having to report on their climate related risk. Anyway, so that's sort of the context, is that it's still really industry focused. It's just sort of using those skills in a different context, I suppose, or a different, slightly different sort of tackling the problem from a different angle. In terms of the skills, yeah, so a lot of it's about communication. That's been a really, really big one. And so, yeah, being able to translate across disciplines and do that. I think the other challenge as a researcher is that it does involve stepping beyond what, you know, Bianca said, how narrow her focus was getting. And so this one is me stepping broad again. And so using the sort of, using those transferable skills from a science degree, from science training around finding, analyzing, synthesizing information, you know, presenting data, understanding probability and all of those kinds of things, and then packaging it in a way that you can communicate it with others. So that would be the big ones.
Thank you. Another question is for Bianca, but I'm sure everyone on the panel has thoughts on this. Could you go a bit more into detail into your experience with some science communication? What kind of impact do you think people can have doing science communication?
Sure, I'll answer the first part first. Science communication is really broad. You could start a YouTube channel, a podcast, an Instagram account, TikTok, write, do public speaking. So it really depends on who your audience is and what you're trying to achieve. Are you trying to encourage the next generation of scientists to get involved? Are you trying to explain in really simple terms how a certain scientific concept works? So I think you really need to have a think about what your end goal is and then work backwards from there. I do believe that science writing is at the core of all science communication. And so you really need to develop your portfolio of articles, publications, things like that. I reached out to a lot of different science media outlets and pitched various articles, got rejected from a lot, but also got accepted in quite a few. And for the most part, it starts off as free work, but then people start paying you, which is always really nice. And of course, the science writing internship was incredibly helpful. And once you start getting your public platform up and people start recognizing your name, it's much easier to get more opportunities and asked to talk at conferences, events like this, write other articles, etc. In terms of what kind of impact do you think people can have, I think that's up to you. Again, I do a lot of talks and it really inspires people to get involved into Cell-Ag. It helps that Cell-Ag is a really cool field of research, so it's an easy sell. But yeah, that's what I try to do. And I know other people try to dispel myths when it comes to vaccines or GMOs, and they do that in a really fun, lighthearted way. TikTok is really, really good for that. Most downloaded app in the world, you're going to have a really wide reach and it's going to be really impactful. But it really depends on what your personality is and what you enjoy doing, because it really shows if you're not enthusiastic and you're not passionate about your science. I'd love to hear from the other speakers too, though.
Any thoughts, Madeline or Jonas?
Yeah, I
If
do. I was
not-
just answering the cotton question in the chat. So yeah, I mean, I support what Bianca said. In terms of the impact, yeah, for me it is about at least partly it's about being that visible role model, because I haven't had them as much, and so I suppose that's one of the impacts, and you don't really know what that will be. Like a lot of, sometimes I get nice feedback, and there was a super cute drawing that a primary school kid did of me and said what I was doing, and I was impressed with their grasp of my research. But I do it because I enjoy it, and it's fun, and yes, I hope that there'll be some spark for somebody around that. And I suppose just a little side note as well with that is I was super shy and reserved growing up. But through my as I grew up, I realized how important that connection was and how important that sense of community was. And then being a youngish woman in science, how important the role models were. And so for all of those reasons, I kind of have developed those skills and practiced them. And so I suppose too, in that sense, yeah, I mean, in the same way, if you get rejections or if you have a go, that's totally fine. The learning is part of the process. And my process, yeah, what I've been doing a lot is that talking in schools. But I think too that what's traditionally considered science communication, as in that outreach stuff, is super valuable. But I use those same skills every day in my research. Like when I'm trying to present stuff on climate risk to bankers, that's also super important. So it's transferable.
100%. Jonas, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think that's an interesting parallel to kind of talking about the risks of science. And I think actually the gain of function debate has been really interesting because COVID has kind of sparked this, for the first time, this realization that some of the virologists are actually doing some pretty scary stuff. And I think, how do you communicate that and kind of also maybe aligning a bit more public interest or like public, opinion with like what scientists are actually doing. I think it's one of the big questions for us, and I think that's what we're facing. Like, should we do like public outreach on biotechnology risks, and is that something that's like we should do? And I think it's a bit of a strategic question. I think in general, science communication is so critical, and we need excellent people for that. And I think I think what is pretty good about COVID is that I think, especially around pandemic risks, many more people have been aware of like these risks. They have become aware of this risk, and also of like some of the scientific background to these risks. And more people know more about viruses, and more journalists have written about this stuff and vaccines and all of that. So I think that's one of the upsides potentially of the COVID pandemic.
100%. This has been a very popular question. Jonas, do you think with better foresight, we could have prevented the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think it's always dangerous to answer on this kind of question. I think, really, I think imagine in the next one, I think we would want to, I think even if we can't prevent it, I think, or like, if we can't prevent the original outbreak, I think we should really prevent the pandemic. So I think we need to have good surveillance. And I think that's really some technical things that we need to put in place there. And then we need to have better countermeasures. So vaccines that we can develop even faster, so that whilst it's still in China, we can like do ring vaccinations or whatever, and like prevent it from spreading all over the globe, so it becomes uncontainable. If we're looking into the scenarios, so say COVID came from an animal, then I think there are some virologists that are quite keen on going into animal populations and characterizing possible viruses. I think I'm not a big fan of that work because it comes with a lot of risk of, first of all, exposing yourself to the virus you're trying to prevent. And secondly, because you actually provide insight into kind of what makes for a dangerous virus. And I think we should probably just be better at like surveilling populations for possible things that could spill over, but not characterize them too much in a lab. And secondly, if it came from a lab, I think then we definitely could have had a good shot of preventing it. Firstly, by either not doing the research at all or creating better lab containment. So I think, that's what I think. I think overall we should focus on detection and surveillance, and I think that would really help in the future.
For the whole panel, how can I get involved in your line of work? What are these workplaces looking for in students at the moment? Yes, if anyone wants to go first. It's always the problem with Zoom, the slight delay, you don't want to talk over
Sorry,
anyone.
I can't actually see anyone in this view, but yeah, I'm happy to go first. So Cell Ag is such a new industry. As I mentioned, the term was only coined 6 years ago. And particularly in Australia, the academic discipline is just basically non-existent, and we're trying to change that. So we really just need anyone and everyone to get on board and understand what the research challenges are. And as I said, there are no products available to market. So basically at every point of the production process, there are research challenges. So from choosing the right cell lines, understanding how we can create food grade scaffolds, automation of the bioreactors, consumer acceptance, regulation, legal processes. No matter what your background, there is a need for an entire workforce to get involved in the space. We've actually developed an online free interactive tool called Pathways into Cell Ag. And basically it answers one of the other questions in the Slido. But we get two types of people coming up to us and saying, how do I get involved? And they're either students who haven't yet decided on their major, but they're trying to figure out what pathway to study to get into Cell Ag, or they've already decided their major and then maybe in the workforce, and they want to know how to apply their existing expertise to this new field. And basically what this interactive tool allows you to do is either choose whatever major you have, and then it can, thanks Stella, it'll link to one of the major problems to solve in the field, or you can have a look at all of the problems to solve, and whatever is really appealing to you, you can see what kind of studies and experience you should be getting in order to be employable in that research project. So yeah, have a look at that on our website. But also please feel free to DM me if you're interested in getting involved, and I'd be more than happy to have a one-on-one conversation with you about that.
Madeline or Jonas, any thoughts?
Yes, my mouse is just being annoyingly unresponsive. Yeah, I mean, we're always looking for people in research, particularly with the pandemic making travel hard. I know that it has been a little bit harder for sort of scholarships for PhDs in the more traditional pathway, but we're always interested in having bright young people come and join us. I would okay, so I took a more traditional path, which is undergrad honours PhD, and that PhD has a whole lot of valuable skills and experiences that came with it, and it's got some valuable bits to it. It is important if you want to develop that independent research career in science generally, but I would also just highlight that if they're going into a PhD expecting a traditional research career is probably not realistic given the job opportunities out there. And to be honest, I feel like, especially where you're coming from, it's maybe not even necessarily the pathway. I think that the breadth and the impact is often coming from the more creative and slightly, that kind of pursuits. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit low blood sugar, I think. But yeah, anyway, basically, and I think too, the other one that I often talk about when I'm talking to students is just that be curious. Like, you don't need, none of us have taken that linear path. So kind of don't feel like you have to copy anything that any of us have done. You will find your way through that. And sorry, I think I've lost the plot. I need to just come off. Okay, I need to go
That's very fair
for a
enough.
second.
No, that's 100% fair. Jonas, what are your thoughts? Do you have any ideas on this question?
I briefly mentioned something earlier. So I think that kind of skilling up, potentially doing a PhD if you're interested in doing like this hardcore countermeasure work, like hard science countermeasure work, like on vaccines, on therapeutics, on sequencing technology. But I think we also need like implementers for all of that, advocate, like I think there's a lot of policy stuff out there. So I think we need to kind of think about advocating for how, for instance, FDA approval can be adjusted for vaccine platforms and vaccine and therapeutic platforms. We need to think about how do we get a sequencing machine once produced into every hospital. We need to, so I think there's like a lot of integrated stuff. And I think really, if we think about like biotechnology risk mitigation, I think, yeah, you can basically come from any area in STEM and or even public policy or economics. So I think it doesn't really matter that much. I think it's mostly that you are keen on working on this and reaching out to people, and I think talking to people, and I think then you will always find a way of getting involved. And if that starts by like being a project that you work on and actually enjoy it, and then you get involved in another project, and then maybe, yeah, you'll like think about, oh, maybe I should do this master's over this master's because it seems more relevant or whatever. I think, yeah, there's a lot of flexibility in the area, and also there are always unexpected changes. And I have to say myself, I'm 1.5 years away from finishing my medical school and becoming a doctor, a medical doctor. But currently, I'm facing this decision. I have like an option to do a PhD in exactly this work that I'm doing half-time at the moment or part-time, and maybe I should switch and do my PhD in biotechnology risk. And it's just really difficult, you know, and there always will be difficult decisions, but you can only like decide once you have your foot in the door to some extent and kind of like know what you're interested in, and then you kind of just need to aggregate all the data and make a decision based on that. So I think, do that.
Thank you for that. Bianca, what's your advice for getting into science communication as a way of working in the area of sustainable agriculture or cellular ag without being a researcher?
So yeah, I think I answered this before. Again, depends on what kind of science communication you enjoy doing and therefore what you're really good at. And depends on whether your goal is to get more talent into the field or to explain the science. And you don't have to be a scientist to explain the science. And in fact, if you don't come from a science background, it means you're going to approach the communication style in a way that a non-scientist can understand it. Scientists are the one that often struggle to explain their research. So yeah, I basically you need to get involved and start writing, start creating content, and get your name out there.
Thank you. Another question for you, Bianca. What do you think are the biggest hurdles for cellular agriculture, and which fields do you think are best positioned to help overcome these?
I'm going to answer this in two ways. So I think the biggest hurdle for the industry in general is the fact that the private sector is disproportionately overfunded compared to academia. A result of that means that all of the discoveries that are happening are locked up with inside these companies with IP, making it really hard for new startups to get involved and for that healthy competition to happen. And that's also really bad for consumer acceptance, because if there's not a strong basis of academic researchers in the field to give objective advice and science communication about the field, then that's when you start developing a lot of mistrust and a lot of corporate concentration. It's obviously something I'm really passionate about. I think one of the biggest technical hurdles, though, that a lot of companies are facing is this concept of scale up. How can we produce millions of metric tons of cultured meat every year for the entire population? How do we know how to culture cells and make them divide, and we know how to create these scaffolds. We know how to perfuse these cells onto these scaffolds, but how do we scale that in a way that's cost efficient, but also that is sustainable? So if you're an engineer, or if you're a bioprocessing whiz, or if you're if you're into computational modeling or mathematics, physics. These are all the major fields that really will transform and I guess solve that scalability issue.
Thank you. Madeline and Jonas, do you have any thoughts on this question? Do you see much or any overlap between your fields and cell ag?
Well, I think if we're thinking about some of those like biotechnological advances, I mean, there are, for instance, some like vaccine platforms that are based on like cell culture systems that are like very malleable. And I think I could definitely see there being some overlap here, especially with regard to the skills that you need to get into those. So I think in a sense, you can skill up and then see like where the best opportunities arise. I think probably like the day-to-day work, like I think is probably, yeah, not the greatest, like, yeah, potential to hit both actively. I think you're probably definitely better off like targeting one or the other to like maximize your impact or like, yeah. But I think definitely with regard to the skills required to go into those, I could definitely imagine it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of lab-based stuff can be applied, and plants have cells too. Sorry, that's the cheeky answer. There's some really interesting work around, actually the work that I was doing on cotton was something called synthetic biology, and to some extent that approach there's potential overlap, I suppose, with the cellular ag and the plant biotechnology that I was doing. And so synthetic biology is an interesting space because it's taking that engineering approach and applying it to biological systems. And so if you're trying to optimize something like cellular agriculture, that can be a really interesting approach. And so it's that design, build, test, learn model, design, build, test, cry when it doesn't work, which is a lot of the time. But yeah, taking that approach and the kind of, so there's one way of scaling the kind of how do we go from lab scale to world scale, but also around the how do we test many different options and solutions in a way that we can get these solutions through and out there as well. That's the other part of it. And so, yeah, that would be another sort of angle for that question.
Thank you. Jonas, in reference to biological attacks, what would be the likely motives of such an attack?
Depends a bit on the timelines. I think technology is rapidly advancing. Viral synthesis is rapidly getting increasingly powerful and accessible. I think over the next 10 years, I think I'm most worried about groups or state actors that are engineering agents. And I think then after the next 10 years, I think we'll be in a world where 10,000s of individuals at least will have access to viral engineering, like to the ability to unilaterally by themselves within 2 days create like a virus that could spread it and cause a pandemic, potentially, if we don't get the technology regulated. And I think then I'm probably most worried about, yeah, suicidal people, people that are depressed, people that are unhappy with their lives and just potentially have a mental illness. And I think we see that people use like whatever they have at hand to like commit suicide. And I think that might be a gun, that might be a plane if you're a pilot. And I think if it's a virologist, maybe it's a deadly virus. So I think once we get into like a world where enough people have access to the ability to unilaterally create these viruses, I think it's just a matter of time until individuals misuse it for whatever reasons or not. And I think that's kind of the world where we need to be really careful.
Thank you very much. We're aiming to end at 6:30, so I think it's a good time to have our last question. We have here, Bianca, what is the best way for undergrads to get involved with cell ag? But I think this could be extended to what's the best way for undergrads to get into each of your respective fields?
Sure. So again, that Pathways tool is a great way to start some research. And we've also got a useful resources page on our website where you can do reading, listen to podcasts, watch some videos, TED Talks, etc. But also join our public Slack channel, which is, the link is on our website. And there are so many people in the cell ag space in there. You can DM scientists, research students, hiring managers, everyone's in there. So don't be afraid to just join the general channel and introduce yourself, and ask people questions and be really curious. People love talking about themselves, so don't be afraid to DM them.
Yeah, I would just say that so if we go really broad, like agriculture or sustainable agriculture, there are lots of different ways you can contribute to that. So we still need the people who can work in a bank and understand what sustainable agriculture means and can advocate for the bank supporting that, for example. So yeah, I mean, that's just an example. So you don't have to be the person doing the science to make the better plants, or that kind of thing. There's a whole lot of breadth there. Similarly, in terms of finding out what people are doing, social media is great. There's lots of scientists on Twitter. There's lots of farmers on Twitter, and so you can get a feel for what's going on there. And as a practical thing, during my undergrad, I worked as a research assistant, and I worked for that consultancy. And so, where possible, ask your lecturers if they've got a bit of work for you to do, and you can get a bit of a taste for that as well. All COVID permitting, of course. But yeah, do get in touch with people. They will be surprisingly happy to talk and to help.
Yeah, I just posted the 80,000 hours profile on global catastrophic biological risks. I think if you haven't read it yet, I think it's definitely a great place to start. And then I think on the Effective Altruism forum, there's a further reading list on GCBR prevention and preparedness. I think, yeah, I mentioned this earlier, I think you should really, if you're really keen to get into this, or if you just want to also orient it more, and I think you should try to reach out to people, talk to people, and if you're keen to get involved, just really make that clear, say, I'm looking for a project, I'm happy to commit 10 hours a week to this, and then I think we might be able to find you a project. So yeah, then don't hesitate to reach out, please. And yeah, I'll just post my email into chat. Yeah, and yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Jonas. And thank you to everyone for coming, and especially very massive thank you to our speakers for taking time out of their evening to come talk to us, or for you, Jonas, I believe, morning in the UK. Such a great wealth of knowledge for the very difficult process of figuring out what to do after uni. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone in the audience did as well. Shout out also to Stella, our wonderful events director who coordinated tonight. If anyone wants to look further into some of the ideas presented tonight, I think in terms of effective altruism, 80,000 hours, definitely, as Jonas put in the chat, and these other resources on the screen. Also, please do check out EA UniMelb if you enjoyed tonight. I've had a great experience personally, both socially and also in the way the club has broadened my worldview. If you enjoyed Bianca and Madeline's content about food and agriculture, you should check out our partner club at UniMelb, the Alternative Protein Initiative. And our last plug for tonight is for Ask Alumni UniMelb, which we think is just really underappreciated as a platform. It's where you can go and chat with a massive amount of UniMelb alumni in practically every field, not just a STEM and research. Links for all these are again in the chat. Finally, if you'd like, please give us any feedback or recommendations you might have through the Google form in the chat. And we're also planning on making this event into a series of career-focused events. Some of our theme ideas involve economics, operations and institutional decision-making, artificial intelligence, ethical philosophy, global priorities. You can vote for these different themes and also suggest other ideas, which would massively appreciate in the Google form and the feedback form in the chat. So finally, again, thank you all for coming, and thank you very, very much for our speakers. And I hope everyone has a lovely night.